Welcome, everybody, to Eckerson Group's predictions for 2024. We have a number of our analysts with us today, and we're going to have a lively discussion about what we think is going to happen in the data industry in the coming year.
All right, Jay, for those of you in the audience, this is really an internal conversation where we cross-pollinate information between our consulting team and our research team, which we do periodically, and we thought we'd just open this up to all of you. I make it one big conversation. We'd like you to chime in with your thoughts and comments about what you think's in store for 2024, or bounce ideas off of our thoughts that we'll present today. So just for background, our research team is Dave Wells. He was the first research analyst at Eckerson Group besides myself. Now Jay Piccionary, which his nickname is now Motown Jay. And then Kevin Petrie, our VP of Research. On the consulting side, we have Carlos Bassi, our data architect, Sean Hewitt and Josh Reed, our inimitable data governance consultants, and Rich Fox. But in any case, this is the team. And again, we'd love to hear your thoughts as we talk about 2024. So you can imagine this has been the year of generative AI. So we had a lot of predictions. Half our predictions were on generative AI. Big topic, potentially revolutionary. But we're going to start with Dave's prediction that Gen AI has lost its luster. And I'm wondering, Dave, if you could explain that a little bit. And does that mean it's just losing some of the hype, but it's still revolutionary? Or it's just going to come completely down to earth and be just another, productivity feature inside of our tools?
Okay. I wouldn't say it's lost its luster yet, but it's going to lose its luster in 2024. I would also say that revolutionary is too heavy-duty a word. It is evolutionary. It's with us for the long term, but it's not going to radically change our world any more than any of the previous silver bullet technologies have radically changed our world. We will see changes. But if you think about, if you're familiar with the Gartner hype cycle, they talk about something called the peak of inflated expectations. And I believe we're going to hit that peak sometime first quarter of 2024. What happens on the Gartner hype cycle after peak of inflated expectations, it's kind of drawn as a curve. It takes a steep dive down to something called trough of disillusionment. And I believe we're seeing early signs of that downhill slope when we see increasing popularity of terms like AI hallucination. And if you're not familiar with that term, AI hallucination, it means presenting things as fact that have no basis in fact. So we'll go down this slope to trough of disillusionment. Oh, it didn't live up to all those expectations, those inflated expectations. And then it does this climb on the Gartner hype cycle to something called the slope of enlightenment, where we begin to climb up to somewhere in the middle where reality is and flatten out on what Gartner calls the plateau of productivity. Okay, so what's going to happen at this plateau of productivity? We're going to find that Gen AI has some good things to offer us, but it's not facts. It's ideas, suggestions, maybe sometimes some inspiration. I was talking with James Serra, I think it was week before last, and he told me that he's found ChatGPT to be really valuable when he's facing writer's block. He just wrapped up a data architecture book that O'Reilly should be publishing sometime soon. But he said ChatGPT has been very helpful for him when he faces writer's block because it sparks ideas, not because it gives him facts, not because it tells him what to write, because it sparks ideas. That's where we're going to come out on this plateau of productivity. What loses its luster, we're going to hit that peak of inflated expectations. We're going to start that slide down to the trough of disillusionment. And somewhere after that, and I would guess by late 2024, reality will set in and we'll be at that plateau of productivity, as Gartner calls it, where we're going to use it for the things it's good at and stop believing that it's going to revolutionize. It's going to take us through another step of evolution, which is, I've been doing this stuff for 55 years. We've been through technology evolutions frequently over those 55 years. I can recall when fourth generation languages were going to set the world on fire. Wasn't it just a year ago that data mesh was going to take over the world?
Oh, it still might. We'll have to talk about that one. So
Well,
Dave, let's those are some provocative statements. I'd like to open it up to the board. Two things. One, we are about to reach the peak of inflated expectations in the hype cycle. And two, is this evolutionary or revolutionary technologies? I think this group will debate both of those. And I'm going to start on the peak of inflated expectations. I don't think OpenAI has been overhyped. Like most technologies in the past, the vendor starts hyping it before it's even delivered it, right? So there is this hype, real hype. No one's received any value for it. But with Gen AI, it was completely different. It just became available and people started using it and it blew their minds what it could do. So I don't think it was hype. I don't think it's hype at all, to be honest. And in terms of revolutionary, evolutionary, I'll let the other group members chime in. I think it's probably more evolutionary. But what do you other guys think? Kevin?
So I think,
yeah, Jay, go first. I have the next prediction, which is about this. So Jay, go first.
okay, so I think that it's probably helpful to consider, where Gen AI is to be used, right? If you think about it as a data technology for data technology, I agree with everything that Dave said, but I think there's a different, I would come up with a different assessment if I look at how Gen AI is used in like, say, the marketing sphere, right? In marketing tech for writing copy and coming up with images and doing content generating content that can then be managed by the marketing team. I think it's going to have more of an impact there than it might have in other spheres. Certainly in my own use of it, I agree with everything that Dave said. It's like it's really intriguing at first, and then I'm in the trough of disillusionment right now with what I actually get out of it.
I need to respond briefly to the marketing comment and the generating of images. And I didn't come prepared to cite the source here, but it was a story that I heard last week on NPR about a university professor asking Gen AI to generate images of Black doctors treating white patients. And it wasn't able to do that. The patients always came out Black and the doctors always came out white. So even generating images, it's coming to us with bias.
Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt.
So I think the good news, and people here know that I'm sometimes painfully optimistic, I think that the outcomes are in part up to us because the razzle dazzle of the software has set in or faded. And now we need to go back to the 40-year-old problem of bad data, which causes the problem Dave's describing. It causes hallucinations. It causes mishandling of intellectual property. It causes privacy breaches. All those things are writ large when you put a large language model on top of bad data. And so we need to really double down on data governance. And I'm hopeful that Gen AI, by bringing AI to the attention of the board and CXOs, will force companies to invest more in data governance and apply it to new types of data like text and images.
All right, so that gets at your prediction, Kevin, Gen AI.
Yes, I overran the lines, didn't I?
And Sumit has now joined us. So Sumit, if you can share your video, do so. But you also had a prediction on governance as well. In fact, you said governance goes global, and that's very similar to Josh's prediction about kind of AI regulations kind of forcing that governance. So I'm wondering if you guys want to comment.
Yeah, for me, with what Dave's saying, I think it is evolutional. And I think it needs to evolve. I would use a different kind of life cycle on AI rather than a hype cycle. I would say it has a learning life cycle that it's got to go through before people can trust it further. If you were to think about this from a Lean Six Sigma perspective, maybe we're at 88% trustworthy, but we want to get to 99 and 6 nines trustworthy when we're done. We've got a long way before we get there.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, Sumit and Kevin, if you can talk about how we are going to get to the point where we trust Gen AI output. I think everyone has been pretty blown away with what it can do with text and even with images. So it's going to be a huge productivity enhancement. It already is in numerous ways that we've already started to hear, from personal usage to programming, I think. But the scary part of Gen AI is what I think has everyone up in arms, which is the hallucinations, the ability for bad actors to use this in nefarious ways, right? With deep fakes and the like. So Europe has taken the lead and come up with this European AI Act to govern the bad sides of AI, especially Gen AI, which it puts in its top tier for risk. So that's one aspect, is the regulatory. The other aspect that, Kevin, you've written a lot about is we're going to get away from these, generally available large language models into small language models that are purpose-built for specific domains or even within a specific company. I'm wondering if you can talk about how that's going to evolve in 2024.
Yeah, I think that the key element of a small language model, and this would be a little different from the way Microsoft's been using the term lately, they're looking more at just lower parameter counts, is that you're getting domain specific, you're applying it to enterprise's own domain specific data. And I think that once you do that, you can move beyond just using GitHub Copilot, you can move beyond using ChatGPT, and you can actually start to create proprietary workflows that improve competitive advantage as well as productivity. It gets exciting, but you have to make sure that you have governed inputs and outputs. And that's where I think three things will happen. One is that humans will continue to not just be in the loop, but call the shots and oversee these AI assistants. Two, this domain-specific processing of data in the form of retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, which is a fancy way of saying that you're injecting trusted content into the prompt and basically giving the language model an open book test, or fine-tuning where you're training it on your own data. And then I think the third thing is that it'll become part of other types of analytics that we can trust more for facts, like a SQL query of a relational database, or maybe predictive ML, where you've got some confidence level in a percentage prediction. So Gen AI will be a feature of the bigger workflows, and humans will oversee it. And that'll hopefully make this more trustworthy and governed.
So I have to ask you, Kevin, because these are language models, do you see that following the path that seems to be taking place in the world of semantic modeling, where we're seeing domain-specific ontologies designed in such a way that they become interoperable? Do you see these smaller language models being interoperable and maybe somewhat ontology-based in the same way that what's going on in the semantic modeling world?
Great question. I think so. I think that companies initially won't be nearly as methodical about it as they could be. They'll be racing to innovate. But part of the benefit will be that a lot of these companies will start with large language models, ChatGPT, Claude, Bard, and so forth. And then they'll fine tune it, or they'll feed it their own domain specific data. So the language model logic will come from, I think, a similar set of big companies that had the resources to do the pre-training. And hopefully, yes, you'll have an ontology, you'll have small language models that can converse with each other, that can synchronize. Initially, my guess is that you'll have applications that'll include a language model element, it'll include a SQL query element, it'll include maybe a predictive ML element, and then some old-fashioned application tasks. So it'll be more important initially for the language model to work with those non-Gen AI elements.
Okay, that feels to me like Ben finally hitting that plateau of productivity.
I hope so.
Sounds like good stuff, and of course, we all know you are the eternal optimist. One of the things
Painfully
we
so.
appreciate about you. One of the
Well,
things
thank
we
you, Dave.
appreciate about you. I also want to point out that we have a question in the Q&A from Kent Graziano.
Oh, good.
Says, does Gen AI governance include reviews of goals, inputs, and output by an ethics panel before putting something into production or using it for decision making? Good question.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
great
it
question.
should. I'd love to hear thoughts from others on the panel too. I think it certainly should.
It absolutely needs to. There's so many considerations. So, we've had a lot of discussions around the hype and the approach for AI, but really we need to get into looking at the actual value and balancing that with the total cost of ownership, and that needs to be part of the governance discussion as well. And recently I had my eyes open to the environmental impact. So a lot of companies are working to meet their sustainability goals and demonstrate to the public that they are meeting those goals. But if they are becoming more aware around the impact of data and the environmental impact of data and AI processing, then they need to be really looking at the value of what they want to do with Gen AI or AI in general, and making an informed decision whether there's true value of doing that, or are they just creating some overhead and potentially expanding their environmental footprint.
Sean, do you have any idea what the impact of Gen AI will be on the environment? Did you come across any stats like that?
Yeah, there is some information out there. So there are some estimates that one AI request, so one call to an AI model, will be the equivalent of having a 10-watt LED bulb running for 1 hour. That's one way that you can assess it. There's, you could challenge that, but that's a good place to start. So that alone doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of requests against one AI model, it quickly adds up. So there's some other figures showing that NVIDIA is set up to ship around 100,000 A100 servers this year. So if all of those are running at full capacity, that would be the equivalent of 5.7 terawatts of energy per year, and that's more than some cities use. I think Ireland per year uses around 25 terawatts. So that gives you a sense of how much power. But even just from a data storage perspective, so 1 gigabyte of data uses around 7 kilowatt hours of energy per year. And if you took all of the data centers globally and looked at the energy consumption, it's around 2 to 3% of the global electricity consumption. And that's growing exponentially. So that's where the concern comes in. It's not how much energy it's using currently, but how fast it's growing. And then you add in AI on top of that, and electric vehicles on top of that. It's really going to mess around with the cost of energy for us, individuals.
Yeah. So we're replacing crypto mining with Gen AI processing.
Ultimately, yeah.
Yeah.
Although crypto hasn't quite died, evidently, so we may still have some of that.
But what we're starting to see, and this came up at the DGIQ conference, we were having some discussions around this, and some people were saying, when they're responding to RFPs, are already being asked to demonstrate the sustainability of their organizations. So if that is a requirement of some of these contracts, that you can demonstrate sustainability, or that your environmental footprint is acceptable, then this is going to be an aspect of governance going forward. So when we're looking at the use cases for AI, the environmental impact of that will be factored into your total cost of ownership.
Yeah. But I did want to go back to the evolutionary versus revolutionary thing before we move on to other predictions. which is, isn't it revolutionary that finally, and correct me if I'm wrong, that ChatGPT was the first time we actually had a user interface for AI for the everyman, right? And that's what makes it revolutionary, is that now any can use these sophisticated artificial intelligence capabilities. That used to be just for the domain of the highly trained data scientist. And doesn't that make it a revolutionary?
Hey, so you cut out a
Don't
little
chime
bit.
in all at once.
Yeah. So,
Also, I want to
hey,
remind
to me at
go
least,
ahead,
but
Carlos.
yeah, so I think it's the first time some, people had like a visible interface, right, to AI, right? People have interface with AI before, maybe they just weren't that aware of it, right? In this case, because the interface was visible, that's actually, I think, where the hype came from, right? It came from not necessarily the company or OpenAI or anybody else, but it came from people, right? People using it for the first time overhyped it. And they came to the conclusion that because it could write a reasonably good poem and be somewhat creative, it could also analyze my financial statement, or a company's financial statement, which there wasn't a bridge from one place to the next, right? Like Kevin's saying,
Yes.
you need to bring those together, but today they don't come together, right? What I see on a web browser doesn't come together with analyzing a company's financial statement. In fact, it'll make a random mess out of it, right, if it does that. So to me, that's the thing, right, is that it was really hyped by people because they did have that visible interface when before when they interacted with it, it wasn't visible.
And I think it's
Yeah,
fair to
I think
say
that's
that
an
that
important
hype
point.
went two directions. People overstated the positives and they also overstated the fears.
Well, true, but I would like to have an AI conversation these days without somebody talking about what happened in the movie back in the 90s or something, right? There just isn't a path from what we're seeing right now to that, right? Yeah.
There is a lot of hyperbole in all directions. I think that's a really interesting point that Carlos, you just made, and Wayne as well. What's interesting is that AI has been built into the background of so many consumer and knowledge worker activities for a number of years now to help spot fraud, to drive sort of more basic natural language processing with chatbots and things. So it's played a background role for a long time. But what ChatGPT version 3, when it came out 13 short months ago, did was bring it to the blaring forefront of everyday knowledge workers and consumers.
So do we have any questions from the audience? And if not, I encourage everyone, folks who are out there, if you have thoughts about Gen AI, send them in and we'll get to them, or someone will. Kevin, you may have to take charge here, looking at those questions as they come in.
I think one of the big drivers for the explosion around it has been the use within the schools. So, right from elementary school right up to post-secondary, I don't think there's any students who haven't used it at least once to assist in some of their work, whether it's an essay or just doing homework. So I think that has really helped drive the popularity of it, and then parents using it as well. As Carlos said, just creating a poem, like a lot of people just want to experiment with it. I think it's going to create a lot of skepticism around legitimate work. So if I come up with a poem for my wife on our anniversary now, the first thing she's going to ask is, did I use AI to create it, or did I do it myself? And so we're going to see a lot of skepticism around everything we see. It's similar to when you are on a company website and you decide to enter a chat. The first thing you wonder is it going to be a bot or a person? So that skepticism is going to be a byproduct of it.
Yeah, I think so. And there'll be a desire to differentiate ourselves by human characteristics and a need to do that.
Yeah, I want to kind of explore that a little bit, because I think there's an inherent fallacy in the question of trusting Gen AI output. Compared to what? Compared to people? So people are inherently more trustworthy than Gen AI? I don't think so.
That's fair.
But don't the deep fakes worry you at all, especially in the political realm?
Sure, you bet. But that to me is a person. The difference between the AI and a person is that the AI can't have intention. That's why we call their non-true facts hallucinations as opposed to lies, right? A lie has intention behind it, and a deep fake is a manifestation of a lie, right? So, I think certainly the Gen AI is going to help, evildoers do evil. But I think, putting that aside, where most of the activity around Gen AI is taking place is, in a business sphere or academic sphere. And what makes, I think if you're saying that if it comes from Gen AI, then you should automatically have some skepticism about it. I would say, you have to have some skepticism given any source, and you have to know the source and understand where it's coming from and what the, ulterior motives might be behind the statements or the output, right? There's nothing inherently true about the output of a SQL query, right? Depending on how it's written and the data that it was written against, right? That can be completely wrong.
So the reality is that we just have one more source of information for which we need to continue to educate people to apply critical thinking to the information that they receive.
Amen. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Question in the Q&A too.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave. Can you read that?
Curious with regards to Gen AI and if the concern for security will incentivize companies to invest in designing their own Gen AI that can only be used within their businesses. And this feels to me like it has some relationship to Kevin's discussion of small language models and a little bit of localized and domain Gen AI. So, Kevin, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that it will be, companies will feed them their own data, and they'll make an effort to make sure that data can be trusted. Because once you feed your own data to these publicly pre-trained large language models, you can trust them more. You can't trust them explicitly, but you can trust them more. You're going to reduce the risks of governance issues, of hallucinations, privacy breaches, and so forth. I don't think many companies will be building their own because the firepower required in terms of dollars and compute cycles to train your own model is extensive. Rather, it'll be people feeding them their own or maybe doing some further fine-tuning on an existing model.
So it's essentially you take an existing like ChatGPT model and you run it inside your own walls so your data can't escape, but you put your data on top of data that's already been trained on, and you're going to get more accurate responses. That's what you're saying, right, Kevin?
Yeah, and you're going to start to adjust the parameters, which are fancy words for numbers that describe the meaning and interrelationships of these data objects. You're going to adjust the parameters to improve the accuracy when it's working on your data.
So do you think you will get to the point where you can ask it to, create a dashboard that gives us insights into customer retention correlated to diversity or something like that? Do you think we'll get to that point?
Well, we might if it interacts with other types of SQL queries, of predictive ML models, and then you could use generative AI to wrap language around the findings. I think for the foreseeable future, it will require an expert to inspect and oversee. It'll make domain experts more productive, but it won't replace them or reduce the skills needed to operate this stuff.
And it'll also increase the importance of metadata as well.
Yeah, very much. Metadata tagging of text files and so forth is going to be critical.
And I feel that this direction is one I actually can confirm because there's a couple of companies we're working with that's exactly the direction. The direction Kevin's laying out and the questions that Dave asked are exactly the direction people want to go in. And will probably be live in 2024 for companies internally.
That's very interesting. In pilot or production?
Well, in production, I think in production.
Yeah.
So Kevin, when ChatGPT came out, I know it could not read database tables, but I think the way people are getting around that is they export it as XML or JSON, and then it can read that. Is that how we're feeding these models, these public models, our own data? Do you know?
Yes, that can, depending on the model and the software used, that can work. But I think that more it's feeding language models documents, PDF documents, emails, customer service records, so text and images, because the language models are really designed to handle that semi-structured stuff. I'm learning from Dave not to call it unstructured. Images, text, things like that.
Right.
And to handle the tables, it really makes sense to have a SQL query engine alongside to complement what the GenAI is doing, rather than have GenAI try to replace it.
Right. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Well, let's move on from GenAI, folks. We have some other predictions here. Sorry, I can't show it on the screen because we lost power. But the first prediction is, well, number 6 prediction is data fabrics take the lead. And this is from Carlos Bassi, who's always been a skeptic of data virtualization, which is a core component of a data fabric. So, Carlos, please explain yourself why you've had what looks like an apparent turn of mind.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say it's a conversion, right? But it's, everybody's still struggling out there and going to struggle even more. You're behind the curve and you're going to even be further behind the curve as things go forward. So everybody's struggling to figure out, how do I manage this data? And I think data fabric in general has a lot of components that speak to a lot of companies and make it a direction forward. It talks about basically using everything you already have and building on top of it, which I think is a good thing, right? You don't need to throw out that data lake house you worked on for a while, or that data lake, or that data warehouse. Keep it and build on it, right? If it's useful. It also talks about, proper data cataloging, metadata management, self-service, interactivity, data interacts with each other. Those kind of things, those concepts are, I think, where the future has to head for people to be able to manage things properly. Will it be a full virtual type environment? I don't think so. I've never thought that. And will people approach it according to the letter of the law? Well, they never do either, right? But they use components that work for them. And it's just hard, right? People are falling behind and going to fall further behind unless they adopt some of these approaches. So I think in general, everybody's looking for where to go with it. And I think that's over concepts like data mesh. I think data fabric's a lot more appropriate for most companies. Data mesh maybe is better for a tech-driven company that has business units that are very tech savvy, tech-driven. That doesn't apply maybe to most organizations out there, I think. So how do you go forward? Well, probably a lot of the concepts in data fabric are probably the best way forward in my mind, and will be adopted in 2024.
So maybe it's akin to developing countries leapfrogging in the telecommunication space, leapfrogging landlines, right, and going right to mobile phones, right? So if you never really built a warehouse or data lake, or built one that was effective, now you can just leapfrog and implement the data fabric, whose mantra, I believe, is just leave the data where it is and we'll go get it for you, and shield you from all the complexity of doing that.
Well, not necessarily, right? I mean, I think you can still build a data lakehouse as part of your data fabric solution, right? It's just not the whole solution. Data you need might come from a real-time application database. It might come from other places. But you make it, like we've always said, you make it accessible to people however they need it, right? So if somebody needs to get data from a data lakehouse and from a source database all at once because of a particular business need, that's what data fabric offers.
Right.
I think it's fascinating to watch the evolution and the shifting in the meaning of data fabric. If you roll the calendar back about 3 years, Informatica would have told you that data fabric was all based on intelligent active metadata. Cambridge Semantics would tell you that data fabric is about smoothing the access to and the understandability and the connectivity of data. So it all depends on a graph. Denodo is the one who likes to define data fabric as heavily virtualization based. The real question of data fabric is weaving together all of the stuff that you do have in a way that it's not a bunch of disparate pieces. It's not a bunch of, continuing the fabric analogy. It's not a bunch of loose threads. It is woven together.
Right.
And in that respect, Carlos is right. We got to start putting this stuff together.
And data fabric is not a vendor solution, right? It's a concept, right? It's a way of working that you don't go out and buy something from Informatica and now you have your data fabrics.
Right. You got to build it.
Right.
Yeah. And for me, data fabric, a very important concept and aspect of data fabric is an abstraction layer over the chaos that exists at where data actually is and how it's stored and what format it's in. There's an abstraction layer that Fabric really espouses that hides that complexity from the consumers of data, right? Now that abstraction layer doesn't necessarily mean that everything is virtualized. The abstraction layer can produce a persistent data object that is still abstracted. A star schema is a persistent abstracted data object.
Right. So, so you got the abstraction layer up here, and you've got to have an orchestration layer down here.
Right.
And you need both of those, one to fit it together in business context, one to fit it together in operational context.
Yep.
So I'm a little confused about the data fabric, to be honest with you, because I've always associated with just data virtualization, which I've been disabused of quite aggressively in the last couple of weeks and by this panel, I think. But let me just pose something to you guys. If you have an existing data architecture with a data lakehouse or data warehouse, and you're running queries, and you have a data catalog, and you've got metadata management, isn't a fabric just adding a data virtualization layer to it? And you
No.
Well, keep disabusing me. Go ahead.
Okay. If I've got a data lake and let's say 3 legacy data warehouses and ETL jobs running to feed those 3 legacy data warehouses and a bunch of data pipelines running to feed AI machine learning and maybe to flow data into and through various zones of the data lake, I've got a bunch of chaos going on. I've got a bunch of data. Okay. If I'm going to weave all of this together as a fabric, I need 2 things to happen. The top layer, that abstract layer, I need something that lets me view this data through a business lens. I don't care whether you call it semantic layer, semantic model, ontologies and taxonomies. I need something that lets me see this data abstracted to business context. Then at the bottom layer, I need some way to manage all this chaos of multiple simultaneous data pipelines. I need to know where my data is. I need to know how it's flowing. I need to manage scheduling dependencies among various ETL jobs and data pipelines and so on and so forth. That's orchestration layer. And now, because out of all this chaos, one little blip can make a huge mess, I need observability coupled with orchestration.
I assume you already do the orchestration because you've got all those things running, right? What you don't have is that abstraction layer.
What I don't necessarily have is automated metadata-based orchestration. A lot of times I have people trying to manage the scheduling and the exceptions and what do we do when something goes wrong and how do we back it out when we messed it up. All of that stuff without having good metadata that tells me about the dependencies among these things, the schedule dependencies, the data dependencies, the availability dependencies. If I don't automate that orchestration.
But I guess what I'm afraid of going down a rabbit hole, but shouldn't you already be doing that even if you don't have a abstraction layer?
It's probably not done across the entire ecosystem, right? You need a view for the entire ecosystem as opposed to pockets.
Right. So it's done in silos. And I think what you're saying is that instead of doing these things in silos, let's orchestrate them all from a central pane of glass or something like that.
Yeah, and if you do them in silos, you don't have fabric. You have a bunch of pieces of something.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they're not interconnected. They're not woven together.
Yeah, but if you just keep doing your silos the way you've always done them, and then you put this abstraction layer on top of the silos and a query federation tool to go get the data, why do you need to change your orchestration? You just keep doing what you're doing. And now you just pull the data back from wherever it is.
Because it doesn't scale. You keep adding things, it keeps becoming more and more complex. You have more pieces you're trying to manage and coordinate.
I think doing the coordination and management at that layer is very complex, right? It's complex anyways, no matter where you do it,
Yeah.
but move the complexity to where you can handle it versus a place you can't handle it.
Yeah, and like Wayne, just because you have a data warehouse and a lake, or a lake house and a lake house and a lake, you can abstract what's in those things if they're already built, but there are going to be new things that come along, right? So where do you have to create a pipeline or a virtualized query for a new data asset, right? And let's just say that the asset is a prospect scoring algorithm, right? A lead quality score, right? You may have the raw material in your lakehouse to feed into a model that would then produce a score. Now you could produce that object that the marketing team could then go and use. You could produce it as a virtual object if it's performant, right? And it makes sense if it's a simple enough thing that can be done in 1 or 2 steps. Or you need a pipeline where you need to have multiple steps and produce a persistent object at the end, which then the consumers would then use. Where do you put that, right? You can put it in your warehouse. You can put it in your data product platform, right? The abstraction keeps the complexity away from the business consumer, and then the underlying fabric that we've been talking about is how you connect the silos so that they're less siloed.
So when you do that development, where is that happening now? Centrally by the people who manage the fabric, or is it still happening out in the lake house or the warehouse?
Well, yeah, data fabric is still a centralized data management platform, right? So it's still centralized, right? Probably IT, engineers, architects, that kind of thing. That part of it is still managed that way.
Yeah, and it kind of depends on whose hype you buy, right? So if you buy the low code, no code hype, then the marketing team is doing that in theory, but that's not something I line up with.
And then we get into the data mesh, which we only have 10 minutes left. That would consume another 2 hours for sure. I know I would rant for at least one of them.
Let me put just a simple statement out there, though, that data fabric and data mesh are not competitors. They're not incompatible. They can work together.
Fair enough. Let's move on to these other predictions here. We've got one on quantum computing by Jay. Jay, if you give us a quick rundown. We got 10 minutes left. We got 4 predictions to go through.
Quantum computing has, for most of its existence, been an academic exercise where the use of quantum computing was directed at figuring out quantum computing. Right, and what caught my eye, and I'm by no means an expert in this, but a recent article about announcements from IBM caught my eye, in which they're talking about quantum utility, which is starting to use quantum computing for something other than figuring out quantum computing. And cloud-based quantum computing, which IBM has had a cloud quantum computing center in the US for, I think, a year and a half or 2 years, and they just opened one in Europe. So this is becoming more prevalent. And they also released a set of like orchestration software that allows you to create a process where classic computing can handle certain aspects of a process that is suited for that level of power, but then can shift up to the quantum layer of resources, kinds of calculations that need that kind of horsepower. So examples are, like pharmaceutical research where you're designing molecules, or material research and development for plain exoskeletons and that kind of thing. So I think it's cross a line where it's starting to be used for things that will more and more show up in the world that we live in, where quantum resources are something we have to draw upon.
Jay, do you think that there's a use case for quantum computing in the home?
In the home.
Can we play video games on our quantum computer and
Yeah, right,
use
exactly.
solid power?
Yeah, well, in quantum computing, you don't ever have to respawn because you're both dead and alive at the same time.
Depends what you observe. I know. I'm just going to
My
observe you
kids will love
alive.
this.
I think those robo vacuums could use an upgrade to quantum, so they could see everywhere around them better. All right, let's move on. Next generation data catalogs make inroads. That's mine. Yeah, we're doing some research on this right now. We were calling this mid-market data catalogs. It's no surprise, or it's no secret, I should say, that some of the earliest data catalog products and implementations really have not succeeded. And a lot of companies who have spent a lot of money on these things are pulling them out in favor of what I would call faster, better, cheaper products. They're faster to deploy, they're geared to business users, so a simpler graphical interface, maybe just a discovery use case instead of full-blown data governance. And they're transparent pricing, SaaS-based, and typically you can get in under $50,000 to start. So very different ROI model. And so far, they seem to be having a lot of success. So that's, anyone want to make some comments on that? Sean, Josh, or data governance guys?
Yeah, for sure. We've seen a lot of these initiatives fail in the past, so it makes sense that the industry is changing, making it easier to get some quick value out of them. So, with newer implementations, really focusing on what is the objective, what are the use cases or problems that you're trying to solve. It's not a plug and play technology. And in the past, organizations would install them, connect them to some data sources, do some scans, and just think people are going to come use it and it's going to drive value, and that never works. So really focusing on what it is you're trying to achieve, who are the personas that you're catering to, what is the journey that you want them to experience, and then making that happen and taking that approach. So the newer vendors have really focused on that end user experience and making it easier to drive value or squeeze value out of the tools.
I would
Yeah,
say,
I will say that they don't have all the bells and whistles of the big guys. They're not enterprise caliber products for sure, but they'll give you 60 to 80% of the functionality. And if that's good enough for you, then you should go that route.
I would say when they throw in data quality functionality into that metadata tool, that becomes really appealing to a lot of customers that have data dictionaries and business glossaries in Microsoft Excel or Microsoft Access. I can see a lot of people flocking to that quickly. It's a much easier business case to make.
Yeah.
So how
and
much
they're
do you
doing
see, Wayne? Next gen data catalogs, how much do you see the data catalog and the Gen AI being woven together?
Oh yeah, that it's definitely Gen AI is a big part of these new catalogs and the old ones as well. Yeah, I mean, it's simple stuff, right? Like, we will use Gen AI to fill in descriptions for all the objects in the catalog or column names that are legible, right?
Well, even for the business glossary, we've heard stories of organizations using Gen AI to create the first draft of the definitions to put out there to start discussion.
Yeah. It might be in pilot, but it's happening and it looks good. I wouldn't say like it's perfect, but it's definitely better than somebody sitting there for a year typing descriptions out for every field in a database.
And I'd assume Gen AI search for data too.
Yeah, that too. And natural language search finally is happening thanks to Gen AI. I mean, some companies who spend a lot of money doing real natural language search are probably bumming out because now it's become a lot easier to do that. Yeah.
Well, and we're seeing it used by some platforms to, rationalize documents, so to scan scan all of your document repositories and kind of predict the probability of one document being a duplicate of another, even in a different language, to help reduce, the proliferation of documents across your network.
Yeah, I saw one product, which I can't remember, that when they generated the descriptions of the objects, they also evaluated the confidence level of those objects, so that you could then, if you generated 1,000 descriptions, you could then zero in on the 10 to 50 that were high risk or low quality scores. And that was all done by Gen AI too, I think. So all right, let's move on to the next one. This is yours, Jay.
Let me pause this for a
Okay.
minute, Wayne. We've got another question.
All right.
And it bubbles back to the quantum computing discussion. Could quantum computing play a role in scaling and optimizing VR for enterprise and consumer use?
Okay, well, I could hallucinate an answer here for you, but I think in reality, the answer is I don't know. Like I said, I'm not an expert in quantum computing. I would just say, to the extent that the amount of processing power, when the amount of processing power is on classical computing is not sufficient, even considering the extent to which you can scale out, on a service like AWS and add more nodes to your to your fleet, when that is no longer adequate, then quantum computing takes it up many orders of magnitude in terms of the processing power that you have. So, I'm going to speculate that eventually, yes, it would show up there. And I kind of, we jokingly addressed this with Josh's question, right, about video games, but sure, usable at a consumer level, which it certainly is not yet.
Yeah. Well, they computing recently, so it's coming to the mainstream, if that's any indication. Hey, you talked about data quality remediation, which the holy grail of data quality will debut in 2024. Do you want to explain?
Yeah, so we have data observability for a while, and then that tells us where things are going off the rails. We've also had, automated remediation in the form of rules and deterministic processes that you have to keep adding to as you find edge cases that your rules don't cover. And I'm in the process of researching for a report on this subject, the extent to which AI, and I'm not talking about Gen AI, I'm talking about regular old AI and machine learning, can then bring a probabilistic element into predicting and remediating data quality issues. And I think there's another opportunity for this, which is, if you look at the data lifecycle, if you can bring to bear some of that capability in the development end of the process. And, I heard a term recently when talking with a vendor called chaos testing, right? Where you inject completely, out of left field data values and so forth into your pipeline and see what happens. I think it could be useful in identifying potential weaknesses in the data pipeline earlier in the development cycle, rather than waiting for it to go into production and for an edge case to show up.
Chaos testing. I love it.
Well, then, I find that very interesting. Like, if you think of failure mode and effect analysis, if we could leverage AI to dream up scenarios where a process might fail, and then we can build test cases around it. Half the problem usually is kind of coming up with those scenarios that you need to test. So if it can create those scenarios and then come up with the test scripts, or even manufacture its own data, do that. So one of the big challenges we have when we are testing exceptions is coming up with the data to support that exception. So if you can create, if you can leverage generative AI to simplify the testing process, even manufacturing that data, that's a huge win.
All right, last prediction, and then we want Jay to queue up his Four Tops music with the proper configuration and data sharing. We'll end with the Four Tops and Jay singing his own lyrics.
Yeah, I have a feeling my mic is going to go out shortly.
Yeah. No excuses. All right, so Dave, you got the last prediction, data collaboration goes mainstream. I'm not sure what you mean exactly by that, so give us the lowdown.
All right, data collaboration is the idea that whether we subscribe to data mesh or not, we have various domains doing their own things with data. If you step out of the analytics world for a moment and think in terms of operational systems, you've got a bunch of different SaaS applications, each managing data in their own way, their own semantic models, their own data models, but the data is overlapping. We have different applications creating instances of customer. Collaboration would be co-creation of customer by all the applications that have interest in creating customer data. You could also talk about collaboration in terms of updating customer data. So you can think about it in context of the things we try to manage with master data management. Okay, I can also shift you over to the analytics world side, where we tried data integration for years, the single version of the truth that nobody ever achieved. Data integration didn't solve all the world's problems. We went this other extreme of let's just co-locate the data and figure it out per use case schema on read. That's solved some problems, but which data do I use and where do I use it and how do I use it? So the idea here is that we can map data to semantics so that we have one common semantic model, one common set of language that describes the things that data represents in business context. We map to those. We can express the metadata as RDF so that it is not only machine readable, but machine understandable. And then we can begin to do things like open link data so that we don't have to put it all into a data lake. We can let it live where it lives, but we can put together queries that pass through this RDF model and say, oh, I have some customer sentiment data in this application, and I have some customer sentiment data in this application, and the various facts that they have overlap in these ways, and I can interpret it through the semantic model such that I can see all these different perspectives. So think about what companies like Cinchi are doing.
I was about to say, this sounds very revolutionary, and the only company I've heard even mention something close to this was Cinchi. I guess we're on the same wavelength then.
Okay, take a look at the Data Collaboration Alliance. It's you can find their website. You can take a look at Data Collaboration Alliance. They're driving this thinking about data interoperability. We've become pretty good at software interoperability and letting software applications talk to each other, but we don't yet have interoperability among various siloed databases, and we can get there.
Interesting.
Through semantic model and open links, we can get there.
So there's more than just Cinchi doing this. You said it's a data collaboration initiative. Is that what you called it?
Data Collaboration Alliance. You'll find their website.
Okay.
And you'll see who's out there. And Cinchi's a big driver behind it. And Canada government, I don't know about financially, but they are culturally invested in moving this direction.
Interesting. Our Canadian analysts will need to look into that. All right, guys, we're 5 minutes over. This was a lot of fun. I wish we had like 3 hours because we were just getting into it. And we didn't even get to talk about data mesh. That would have been fun too. So I want to thank you all for your time today, your insights. I want to thank everyone in the audience who's still there for listening to us. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And we try to do this now on a regular basis through our What Works series, which we'll put on again in the wintertime. That's where I interview each of these guys separately in their area of expertise. Well, anyway, thanks everyone, and have a great holiday season. We'll see you in 2024.